All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the History Senior Comps presentations. For those who don't know me, for our guest, I'm John Thabiti Willis. I teach African history here at Carleton College, and I'm excited about the History Comps presentations you're going to hear from Morgan, Aaron, Rebecca, and Pierce. I've posted previously, but we'll post again in the chat a copy of the comps poster, so you see the names, the date, and the title of their presentations. And just to make sure we have ample time for the presenters and for questions that will come at the end. So if you can hold your questions till the end of the last presentation, that would be great. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Morgan Benton Coleman. And again, thank you all for coming. And finally, we will have Pierce McDonnell. Pierce.
Thank you to our guests for listening to all of our comps presentations today. Learning about other students' research has been one of the most enjoyable parts of the comps process. Thank you to Professor Willis for hosting this event and for advising me in our comp seminar. And thank you to Professor Igra for introducing me to the history of the Progressive Era and for being my content advisor. My comps examines the American home front during the Spanish-American War of 1898. I focus on a Tennessee State Regiment's 5-month stay in the Army bases of San Francisco. This regiment's visit to San Francisco was seen to hold a particular political significance at the time, because the 1st Tennessee was the only state regiment to arrive from the South. In a period of intense regional divisions, some interpreted the regiment's visit as a sign of national unity, an indication that the United States had finally healed from the Civil War. Historians have written 3 histories of the 1st Tennessee Regiment, the first in 1899, the second in 1974, and the third in 1988. While the history of this regiment has been covered by these earlier writers in much detail, an important event escaped the attention of all 3 accounts. Without this critical detail, we cannot fully understand the 1st Tennessee's visit to San Francisco. Instead of focusing my attention on the military base, located here, I looked at life in the community outside its gates, located here. I have a personal attachment to this location because this is the neighborhood in which I grew up. This family photo depicts the students of a local grammar school. My great-grandfather, 11 years old, is here. The story that I focus on in my comps is something that affected the family of one of his classmates, Mabel Thomas, pictured here. Mabel Thomas was the daughter of Zero and Winnie Thomas, one of 6 children. Zero and Winnie Thomas were a Black couple originally from the state of Virginia. In San Francisco, Zero Thomas helped to found, among other organizations, the Afro-American Cooperative Association, the local mutual aid society that promoted Black-owned businesses in the city. Their eldest son, Daniel Thomas, was a local entrepreneur who had just started a small crab fishing business. He purchased a boat and set out on San Francisco Bay each morning to catch crabs, which he sold to his contacts at local saloons and hotels. The fact that since the 1880s, the Thomas family had owned their own home and attended integrated schools is remarkable given the broader context of the Jim Crow era. The year 1898 was a low point for civil rights. 2 years prior, the Supreme Court had decided the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896, upholding the constitutionality of segregated public facilities. Some states, including California, responded by establishing local civil rights laws, which outlawed segregation within the state's borders. The Thomas family's close friend, Theophilus Morton, had been instrumental in the passage of California's laws. Of course, California was no paradise of equality. Racial discrimination in hiring, for example, was widespread. Additionally, Asian American students were still required to attend segregated schools in San Francisco into the early 20th century. Nonetheless, in the era of Jim Crow, civil rights organizations had made significant gains in California. Some of the soldiers of the 1st Tennessee were reluctant to respect California's new laws. Many Black residents of the city reported having been insulted and sometimes even attacked by the soldiers in public bars and restaurants. In response, the regiment's leader, Colonel Smith, wrote an open letter vehemently denying all these allegations. However, this did not resolve the issue, and 2 months later, the 1st Tennessee would cross paths with the Thomas family. After completing a crab sale at a saloon just outside the gates of the Army base, Daniel Thomas encountered 2 drunken soldiers from the 1st Tennessee. They asked him for cigarettes and 10 cents to buy a beer. When he refused, one of the soldiers punched him. Daniel Thomas fought off the 2 soldiers and rushed home. As he explained the situation to his mother, a crowd of several hundred Tennessee soldiers began gathering outside his home. They started throwing rocks through the windows and eventually stormed the house, destroying the Thomas family's furniture, injuring his mother and his younger siblings, and stealing several of the family's possessions. Just as the mob was about to capture Daniel, the regiment's officers intervened and drove off the crowd at gunpoint. The assault on the Thomas family prompted the immediate criticism of several important military figures and leading members of the public. Many articles were written about the controversy in the local press, and it also attracted the attention of national newspapers. Local civil rights organizations held a series of mass meetings, which were attended by hundreds of San Franciscans. They demanded that the attackers face punishment and that the family be compensated for their property damage and emotional distress. The Thomas family was represented by lawyers hired by the Afro-American League. Unfortunately, the consequences for the regiment were ultimately fairly minimal. Out of the hundreds of soldiers who had taken part in the mob, 1 was sentenced to 3 months in prison, while 3 were charged and acquitted. The military commission, which led the investigation, did award a small payment to the Thomas family, but it was far less than their lawyers had hoped to recover. Meanwhile, as the investigation was underway, the regiment's reputation grew even worse. In September, a drunken soldier shot and killed a local shopkeeper of German-American ancestry. This soldier was also acquitted. Given the scale of controversy generated by the 1st Tennessee during their time in San Francisco, it's surprising that the histories written about the regiment are almost completely silent on this point. None of them note the death of the shopkeeper. The first 2 did not describe the attack on the Thomases, and while the most recent of the 3 does note it, it does so in passing, and the details are not accurate. The account reads, on another occasion, about 400 members of the regiment nearly killed a Black man who had assaulted a Tennessee soldier with a pair of brass knuckles. In the course of my research, I found that the brass knuckles story was fabricated by the 2 soldiers who attacked Daniel Thomas. Witnesses, including his neighbors, the saloon keeper, army generals, and civil rights organizations, all said at the time that that story was a lie. As we look back on this event now, it's important that we get these details right. History is often about broad, sweeping events, but it involves specific, real individuals. Of course, the 1st Tennessee's attack was a single moment in the broader story of Daniel Thomas's life. Life moved on. He got married a few years later and raised his own children in the neighborhood. Here I'd like to play a short video. In the 1970s, the San Francisco African American Historical and Cultural Society conducted interviews with 2 of Zero Thomas's descendants. In this video, I've compiled audio clips from those oral history interviews with images from various sources I used in this project. The first interview was with Daniel Thomas's daughter, and the second is with his niece, whose father served in the Philippines during the war.
Now, was he a native born California?
Oh, yes. My father was born here, too. Grandpa's name was Zero L. Thomas.
Zero?
Yeah, Z-E-R-O.
Now, they didn't come during the gold rush period, then they came later.
A little later.
Mm-hmm.
But his children were born here.
My mother was born in San Francisco, California, a few blocks from the Presidio on Greenwood Street, known formerly as Cow Holler.
And your father's name was?
George Raymond.
And where was he born?
Clarkstown, Virginia.
How did he happen to come to California?
It was at the end of the Spanish-American War.
Was he in that war?
Yes. And he came out here with his regiment, and they settled right in the Presidio.
Did they serve in Cuba or in the Philippines?
The Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
As we look back on that brief moment in history in the summer of 1898, what broader historical meaning does this story have? It illustrates that the First Tennessee's visit was no magical moment of unity, but more importantly, it demonstrates that bringing together and healing the United States was about more than reconciling the North and South politically, but truly providing justice equally to all Americans. On behalf of the four of us who presented today, I want to thank all our guests again for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you so much for some wonderful, stimulating presentations reflective of the hard work that you've been pursuing over the last year. I open the floor for questions from anyone from the audience.